BioWare have gathered up their staff for a talk, new information has emerged on Fallen Order, and Amy Hennig has opened up on the fate of her doomed Star Wars projects, plus a whole bunch else. It's another loaded episode of the Roundup. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Roundup, our Tuesday and Friday gaming news show that keeps you up to date with all the interesting stuff that's going on with our industry. Be sure to check out yesterday's deep dive episode on the business models of single player, as well as our reports on Randy Pitchford and EA's rather scummy marketing spin on Fallen Order. Oh, and patrons, next Monday's deep dive is now live. Okay, with all that said, let's get into the news. Okay, time for a quick BioWare update. According to his sources, Jason Schreier has mentioned that the company held an all-hands meeting quite recently. Now, while there are no super major bits of news from this, Jason did mention that it included them talking about the issues raised by Kotaku's articles and through the company's own internal feedback mechanisms, and did include talking about their production process and the Frostbite engine. According to Jason, some of the company were left hopeful while others were skeptical, which I do think is rather fair given just how bad things reportedly got at the studio. Interestingly though, Schreier did say that he thinks their internal response has been a lot more serious than their public one. Of course, that response being one that was met with widespread criticism. Overall, I think it's interesting, and it does tie into a few topics that we'll cover later in this video, especially with Frostbite and with Crunch. Of course, as we know, Respawn actually made Jedi Fallen Order in Unreal 4. Of course, I wish the BioWare staff the best, and if this whole situation teaches us anything, it's the place of true journalism. Sure, reposting press releases and doing PR interviews for companies is fine, but work like what Jason did here is the forcing function that makes the industry better. Next, we have a lot more to talk about with the upcoming Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. So first, it actually came at the expense of another game at Respawn, one that staff were reportedly excited about, but it's not a bad thing like you think. So according to Stig? I don't know, we'll go with Stig. So according to him, the game director, EA actually approached Respawn with his potential Star Wars project, and that his team was unanimously interested in pursuing it. Basically thought, well, this is our chance to work in Star Wars, and they were really excited. Then over the next few months, they didn't really know what the story would be, they didn't have contact with Lucasfilm, but they instead were working on testing out their gameplay mechanics. Now, it's an interesting birth of a game for a few different reasons, given how at the time, of course, Respawn were not actually owned by EA, with them seemingly being able to therefore get around the EA sort of company-wide mandate to use the Frostbite engine. Of course, Titanfall 2 and Apex Legends were both made using a modified version of Valve's Source engine, while Fallen Order is of course using Epic Games' Unreal 4 engine. So in the same interview, he talked about the combat system of the game. He said that you really have to understand the enemies that you're going up against, which I mean, I very much hope so, and that groups of enemies will have their own strengths and weaknesses, and that it's on you to use your skills to take them down and work out the combat puzzle. I mean, so far that sounds like Games 101, but if really enemy variety is a big focus for them, that would of course be a very good thing, and there's a lot of games that really do mess that up, surprisingly. Chopping through cannon fodder is not really that fun for extended periods of time, and just about all of the best games have a variety of enemies who will combine together in groups to create highly varied encounters, of course with Doom being the classic example of that design being done well. Now, he then went on to say that the game in some ways is inspired by Wind Waker and Metroid, referring to your character's upgrades and how that all interacts with enemies and your choices of strategies and the enemy variety. He then went on to confirm that the game will have boss battles, and yeah, that's not a whole lot to go off. I'd assume they would have, boss battles. And our final bit of information is a little bit more vague, but I think very promising. Regarding game length, he said this: "It's safe to say it's not going to be a short game," with him then going on to reference, people assuming it would be a quick 5-hour campaign and saying that that is not the case. And it certainly is an interesting one. Content-wise, it just seems to me like this must have been a smooth project. I'm assuming, single protagonist, sort of linear, created with a very well-known engine, probably with excellent tools. So really a content pipeline that perhaps just did allow for Respawn to make a really large game as far as single-player linear ones go. Of course, though, there was another big Star Wars game, a single-player one that got cancelled, and its lead, Amy Hennig, has opened up about the project. So first, remember that when Ragtag was cancelled, EA mentioned that consumers didn't really want one-shot linear single-player games. So given that they're just about to release one, well, that quite is something. There's obviously been a shift here. So here's the quote from Amy. "It's odd. I have to be candid with you. I mean, it's coming from the EA Star Wars handle, so it's certainly part of the plan, but I don't know whether it's implicitly referring to previous comments that were made after our project was killed." Of course, that's referring to what I mentioned earlier with EA and their reasoning, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. Amy then went on to talk about how the industry is changing all the time, and that during her time at EA, there was quite a lot of back and forth with the publishing side of things, basically on what they wanted, with really just everyone trying to figure out what the right path was. It really did sound like she was describing a pretty muddled state of things that I would assume was the company trying to wrangle more of its titles into the games as a service model, which is something that we know EA have been wanting to do. Amy then went on to say this about Respawn. "Respawn's game has the benefit of being largely developed before they were acquired. It is a protected entity, and Vince Zampella makes very sure, because he's part of the executive team at EA, he can protect the interests of Respawn." Of course, we do know that Fallen Order was in development since, I believe, 2016, and the Respawn was, of course, acquired in a deal worth over $400 million in November of 2017, so that's just shy of maybe 2 years into the game's development. It's kind of hard to know exactly. Now, Amy then went on to talk about the change of heart at EA, because there are things which were not acceptable during her time on Ragtag that are happening with Fallen Order, with her mentioning the public backlash to what EA said about Visceral's cancelled Star Wars game and maybe referencing, just things changing. Amy went on to say that she doesn't really know why this shift has happened, but she did note that Patrick Soderlund and Jade Raymond are no longer with the company, saying that there are a lot of reasons why the change in direction could have happened. So, a changing market, different decision makers with different opinions, maybe a different company direction, or I would personally speculate, maybe them thinking it could be an Origin Access premium platform seller. Anyway, before we go on to what she said about Ragtag, there's one thing that wasn't touched on in this interview, which I think makes a lot of sense, but was talked about quite a lot in Jason Schreier's report on Ragtag's development troubles and cancellation. It seemed like the project was basically going nowhere fast, facing disagreements with management, problems with the Frostbite engine, and an expensive-to-run California-based team. Now, look at Respawn, okay? They are using Unreal 4. It's a far more fit-for-purpose engine, I would say, for this. It's got better tools for a project like this, and as we'll soon cover, they may be making a more straightforward game than what Hennig's team had planned. So it could essentially be that Ragtag was just a more difficult, ambitious project, and that's part of the reason why it was risky to the point of being cancelled. So, Amy went on to talk about the game concept. It was an ensemble game in terms of its cast, of course, unlike her previous project, Uncharted, where that was all through Nathan Drake's perspective. Ragtag would involve this big ensemble cast, plus it would also have cutaways to villains, which sort of brings it more in line with what you would expect from a Star Wars narrative. Now, this ensemble cast led to them really trying to support that with the design and development, meaning they needed a good character AI system, and this is one of the things that would have set Ragtag apart from Uncharted, even though they were in the same genre. Amy ended by talking about the big Lucasfilm's roadmap of, films, TV shows, and games, and how at the time it was very exciting to be part of building up this new Star Wars canon, with her feeling like the games were being treated very seriously. And I suppose that is one reason why the Respawn team may have been so excited. This was a stab at being a really big part of the re-established Star Wars canon, which would be very motivating for many people. Ultimately, I think Ragtag probably died for a mixture of reasons. They seemed to run into trouble with the likes of Soderlund and Raymond, and they were burning a lot of money. They seemingly were struggling with their tools, amongst other things. It could very well be that it's a very different situation to Respawn, who seem to have had a more clear development cycle on a more linear game, with the perspective of one character that's being made an extremely well-known engine. Next, Crunch and Telltale. Crunch once more has came into the gaming news through an interview with the Telltale Games co-founder. He basically talked about how crunch happened a lot at the studio as they were struggling to replicate the success of The Walking Dead. This of course has led to another big wave of anti-crunch sentiment making the rounds, and I think that likely is a good thing, especially in light of the recent BioWare situation and the terrible impact that crunch had in many people's mental health. Certainly, at AAA's, crunch should never be a thing. No one should ever be talking about BioWare magic. That said, there are a few contexts in which I disagree. What is very clear to me, though, is that crunch overall is slower and comes with more of a cost. You're borrowing tomorrow's happiness, but you're really losing some, like net. So what does this all mean? Well, crunch should never be part of the plan, but I will say this. I kind of crunch a lot personally. There have been times such as BlizzCon coverage on my other YouTube channel where I've crunched, my team has opted to crunch with me. There are times where the force multipliers and the impact of one's work are such that actually inefficient hours at a high cost can still be a net gain. Here's the thing, like on YouTube, something happens, if you want to grow your channel, well, you have to seize that moment and go. In that case, a 40-hour work week will only hold you back. There are extremely limited times where crunch can make sense in other contexts, and let's be real, we all know this. Sometimes a fire has to be put out, and it's inconvenient to do so, but it needs to be done. If you don't do it, well, the fire just might burn the whole place down, speaking metaphorically, of course. I'll say this though, and I more say this because I see the analytics for this channel, I know that, many of my fellow 20-somethings are watching. So I think by default, because of how we're socialized, everyone wants to work a 40-hour work week and then just chill with their friends or do stuff like that. Well, what I'd say is when you're young and if you want to get ahead, you should really be working 60 and you should take that extra 20 hours from time that you just otherwise be wasting anyway. Even if you have a 40-hour week job, well, try to think about how you can put another 20 hours into personal development work. That stuff really compounds. So I'd say, yeah, crunch in AAA studios is appalling. It should pretty much never happen. If your job asks you to crunch, you shouldn't do it lightly and you should really think about why. But I don't think that very correct sentiment should be confused with a 40-hour work week entitling you to a above average level of success. And I know that in the current environment, that's a pretty edgy thing to say, and I know it is somewhat off topic, but I know a lot of young people are listening, many people, of a similar age to myself, and I see many people, even in my own life, who really hold themselves back for no good reason, so I think it's important to say that. Next, some quick-fire news. So, Apple are said to be committing $500 million towards their arcade service. Of course, that's of great personal interest to me, given that we are making a narrative game right now, so, sending out the feelers there is very much something that I plan to be doing in the future. Then in Overwatch news, well, they have a new PvE mission on the way. But let's be real, they still don't have a pick-ban system in comp, they barely have any core content, their updates are extremely rare and slow. Just what is Blizzard doing with the Overwatch IP? One mission a year is not enough. It's such a wasted opportunity, to the point where at this stage, I've just got to assume that we're going to see something pretty darn major at BlizzCon. And then past that, an interesting tidbit in that Superhot VR has generated more revenue than Superhot itself. Likely, of course, due to it having a higher price in VR and everyone with a VR platform, myself included, pretty much owning it. So there you have it, another news roundup, this time with just about more Star Wars than ever and a nice look at the troubles of AAA development and just the realities of that. And that's really what I love, with covering the industry. Almost every topic in a video like this gives us a jumping off point into something deeper that we can all learn from. And I'd say more than anything, that's the thing that motivates me to work on this channel. It's kind of getting the interesting little things behind the headlines. So, in the spirit of that, Deep Dive went up yesterday. Of course, there was one the week before that, and should all go to plan, there should be 54 of them in, the next calendar year. I'd like to make that a successful weekly series. So the Deep Dives are there, and there's just so much other content in this channel. There's plenty to check out. So thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think about all the topics down below, and with that, I'll see you next time.